And then in my own studies, I've started to see these through lines of belief coming before ability. John D. Rockefeller, for example, when he was young, would tell people, I'm going to be the richest person in the world. I'm going to be the richest person in the world. That's an outrageous thing for a young guy from a poor, bigamous family to say. Outrageous. But he believed it. And the ability basically conformed itself to that belief.
The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Vitruvian Podcast, a podcast about the pursuit of truth and personal renaissance. I'm your host, Zach Shankin. Today, I'm joined by Nolan Wilson. Nolan is a creative entrepreneur, scholar athlete, and Wi-Fi outlaw. He is the host of the Tyro Experience podcast, which I have appeared on previously, a podcast showcasing the great stories and men of history with an emphasis on strength, masculinity, and the frontier mindset. Nolan is a man of high character and someone I'm glad to call a friend. Super excited for our conversation today. Nolan, welcome to the show, bro.
Thanks, Zach. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, dude. It's for those just listening, we are enjoying the weather here in our local state of Georgia. Nolan is hosting me at his place right now. We've got a fire. So this is like a very, I don't know, it's just like the perfect environment.
Yeah.
These are the kind of conversations that, recorded or not, are almost inevitably going to be super, super interesting. And I think there's a lot we can and will go into. We have so many like overlapping interests. But yeah, it's been close to probably a calendar year at least since we last saw each other in person. And then
I think it was here
longer than that since you initially reached out to myself.
That was April 20, or no, that would have been July 23.
Wow.
When I initially reached out to you, I think.
Yeah,
So
no, it wasn't. I think I remember iterating this on your podcast. Like it was very early in my journey, but it was one of the first touch points where somebody else had reached back out to me, and the roles were reversed, which was a very surreal moment in the, I guess, creator verse to like have somebody recognize like your work as at least interesting or engaging. So I'm super grateful for like you making that initial outreach and the fact that we grew up down the street from each other and there's all these like mutual connections and we wouldn't have known otherwise. I know we were talking off air about just like the internet as a tool for connection and dilating space-time basically to like access amazing individuals. It's profound and I know it's benefited your life tremendously. And yeah, I constantly have to like pinch myself. It's even like these little experiences, right? Like we're just sitting in your backyard, like podcasting. This is our life. Like we do this.
Yeah.
So yeah, super,
came a
super
long
excited.
way from July 2023 for sure.
Yeah,
cool.
How has that evolution been for yourself? I guess it's probably worthwhile, given that our platforms are still growing, to give people an idea a little bit about your origin story.
Yeah.
I know it's a lazy podcaster question, but I do think it's important to kind of ground in like who are we listening to and like why does it matter?
Sure.
So what do I need to know about Nolan Wilson to understand the man that sits before me today?
That's on that note. So I used to ask at the first question of every podcast, I would not have any other like organized questions, but I would say, how'd you get to where you are from where you were being however far you wanted to go? Because it's also interesting. I don't think about how to articulate my story every day.
Right.
So it's a lazy question, but in a lot of ways, unless you're going on a lot of podcasts and you're telling your story all the time, it's kind of nice to be able to reflect. But yeah, the TLDR, grew up Atlanta, Georgia, pretty close to you, relatively speaking. Athletics were my love. Every sport you could possibly put in front of me, I was doing. Eventually narrowed down to baseball, played baseball competitively in high school, and then went to Virginia Tech to play college baseball, finished up at VCU, had some phenomenal experiences there. And that's sort of where like my intro into the, let's say, non-traditional route was actually through health. Like I was always looking for like some edge in baseball, so I started going down these little like weird health rabbit holes that my teammates thought I was crazy for. But then when I stopped playing baseball, I kind of just parlayed that into a lot of other things. From there, I knew for a fact I didn't want to get a corporate job. I had 2 degrees, which is kind of funny. That's not a flex because I didn't go to school to get those degrees. It was for baseball. But I haven't used them at all. Done landscaping, for myself, worked in construction as a project manager for a family friend, and through Twitter got my current job that's continued to grow and allowed me to grow with it and allowed me to build the podcast and my brand as well. So here we are.
Here we are. And I love that. I mean, obviously we share a lot of the same mindset around choosing that non-traditional path, and also the love of the great men of history. And it's a paradox that I think very few, I don't know if you experienced it. Like I always had my kind of eyes on the horizon. I remember getting into university as a freshman, and I was in a fraternity, so you kind of had this 4 to 5 year layer. Like you could see the evolution of people. And I remember as a freshman, like intentionally trying to sit down with the fifth years and the seniors who were accepting and preparing for full-time offers. Like, are you excited? Like, how are you planning for your life? And I just couldn't really get a compelling answer out of many people. You know, they're like, oh, it pays well. I'm like, well, are you excited to do it? I'm just like, and so it seemed to me like just this obvious miss, to not really go out and like take a swing for a meaningful existence. And I think so many people are willing to, or potentially distracted by just the allure of capital. And it seems like their life passes them by so rapidly with them essentially not having lived it at all. And I think it's so cool. And I think it's also very important for guys like you and me to find those like minds. Because I'm sure, especially probably in that baseball era as well, when you are the one guy, it's hard to be the one crazy guy.
Yeah.
But it is very reaffirming when you start to find a few of the other, you know, crazy, barefoot, whatever, grounding, the people doing the stuff that you're doing, that you're like, okay, this isn't crazy. Other people have tripods. Other people are making podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can create a normal environment. Was that something that you struggled with, like identity and?
It's funny you say
in?
that. So I actually had a really cool reaffirming moment on that 2 weeks. You talk about serendipity and these little tiny green lights in life. So at VCU particularly, that was my 5th year. I graduated from tech, transferred to VCU, and that's when I found like the soul bras and like the esoteric health side of stuff. And I was like, okay, I started getting to grounding, started getting to like just getting in the sun as much as possible, eating whole foods. I had already eaten healthy, but like that's when I really started. That was an inflection point. And so I got to VCU. Nobody knew me, and I did well. Like I was a good member of the team. I performed well, so that's important because I was the guy like on bus trips. We'd stop at a gas station, and I'd go step in the grass, or I'd go lay in the grass.
Yeah.
I would be bringing gallons of water that was filtered. I'd be buying Mountain Valley spring water. I was the guy that they thought was like, people would be like, what the hell's going on? But I performed well, so people, and I was older, so people really took stock. And it was honestly kind of cool because it started throughout the year. People started asking for like, hey, well, what is that? Why do you do that? Yeah. And so the reaffirming moment on that, I was watching the Ohio State game 2 weeks ago at a Ohio State bar in Austin with a couple other friends, and this guy walks by me, and without even thinking, I'm like, Joey? And he looks up, he's like, no way. And so long story short, I played with him at VCU, and we started talking, and he's like, I was like, dude, you look good, man. Like, you're looking healthy, like looking really lean, healthy. He's like, dude, I got to be honest, man, I'm still doing a lot of stuff that you were talking about.
Let's go.
So it was a really cool thing. I didn't expect to have that sort of reaffirming moment, but it was cool. I'm like, dude, I had an impact on this guy that's lasting 3 years later.
Yeah.
That's changed his physique, changed his appearance, changed how he presents himself to the world, how he feels about himself.
Yeah.
So all that to say, I don't think I've always had, and I feel like you have as well, I've always had that sort of, I was going to do my thing, and yeah. I was the odd man out a lot of times, but it can be a green light for other people to start doing those things, and it's just cool to have that green light for me. Yeah,
it's amazing, and I do think that those moments are, even for the very like independent, I'm going to march to the beat of my own drum types, at least for myself, like it matters, like, and it feels really, really good. And especially for me, like I was raised in like not such a healthy family situation, like physically healthy, like food, diet, etc., lifestyle. And for a very long time, I mean, even since before I feel like I had like a decent thesis on health, even just the basics of like moving your body every day, eating whole foods. In high school, I was just like begging my parents, like just like to try to do something. And it was very much this like adversarial kind of energy. And it's like the classic phrase, you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And eventually, as I found my peace with that over time, and just continued to like stay the path for myself, only now finally on this crazy non-traditional path, you know, traveling the world, going like places people in my family have never been, doing super non-conventional life path stuff, because I've kind of maintained it for like enough duration, it's no longer this like crazy, like, I guess Zach's trying this, to be like, oh, it's just what he does.
Mm-hmm.
And it's finally created enough space for, like what you're saying, the natural curiosity to crop up, where, you know, I'll get a text from a younger brother like, what is the best cooking fat to use? Or like, what should I be looking out for on the back of like food labels? And it's those small things that are, to me, they're such foundational wins, because I mean, you and I, like, we, especially because of the podcast, we live a lot in like the realm of ideas, like philosophizing on virtue and whatever, like,
especially in our particular
in our particular interests, like we it's very up there. But I think, at least for myself, we take for granted how big that needle mover is at like level 1, which is just getting into the sun, touching the ground, eating whole foods. That's like 95% of the return you can get. And I think that you really can break people out of like a malaise of low health into a world where then they can start thinking about these higher ideals. I wrote a piece a while back about like the spheres of vitality, and it's kind of this ascending ladder where like vitality has to be the base of the pyramid. It has to start there before you can start philosophizing on what truth might or not be, because you can only think clearly when the body is pure. And then from there, what is my role to like give as a creative force in this world? And obviously we're both in that state where now we're no longer just consuming, but we're creating for the world. But it was only because of like the work we did with our body initially to be able to get there.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think it's funny how stuff ends up coming full circle with the health. Because again, like with my content and whatever, I just don't talk about it that much. It's just not super central.
Yeah. You still live it.
But I live it every single day. And I think I take for granted how important it is. And so it's something I'm trying to circle back to this year, especially with launching like Virtus Athletica. And I know you have some brand stuff we can get into in a little bit. Just like wanting to make an impact in that health world as well, like to help people take that first step forward. And you're connected obviously not only with your job, but like just having lived in the Vitality House with Noah Ryan and all those guys, like dude's making a really big impact in the world of health. And now timeline wise, we've got RFK in office.
It's crazy, dude.
Like real stuff is happening. It used to just be these niche Twitter conversations 3 years ago talking about like raw milk or whatever else. And now you see it on like Fox News. And you're just like, what is happening?
It started on like our little community on X, which I will not say I'm a part of it now. I joined Twitter pretty late. I have friends.
We're the freshman class.
Yeah, 100%. But like raw milk, seed oils, Maha, like the Make America Healthy thing, that all started on like not like no exaggeration. Like people that are listening to this that saw it on Fox News, that conversation started on Twitter.
It feels like a privilege to be in this little corner that we're all mutuals with. And like the way I describe it, and people obviously in our corner totally agree with this. I think it probably sounds a little bit insane to anyone that might be listening on the outside, but I describe it as like it's the equivalent of being in the Agora in Athens or like the Forum in Rome. Like we are at where the thought leaders are, and it's like 3 to 5 years ahead of where the trends are going, which is why I'm excited specifically with Virtus Athletica, like to be building a brand in the health space, because like all of consumer products, the entire marketplace is now waking up to like wanting a health conscious option, which means the entire market share, all the consumables, people will still want to consume them and still want to purchase them, but just more health minded. So all this attention is moving, and we get a really unique window like 3 to 5 years ahead of time, and we're right in there, you know, like we're having these people on our podcast. It's just incredible. And I also was very late to the game. I think I made my account in probably Jan 2023.
I was April that year, so right around the same time.
Yeah, same time, and like catching up on all the lore and all the background that like we weren't super privy to. It's funny.
The lingo,
it goes
syntax,
deep.
Yeah, it does.
But then you start meeting the mutuals, which I know we were also talking about. This is an example of that, but bringing those relationships in person and seeing who's actually like walking the walk versus just kind of like LARPing on Twitter. It's cool to see, and it's why like I choose to keep you as a friend and respect you a lot, because like you embody your philosophy, which I think is like a rarity amongst rarities.
Yeah,
Like not
I
only in
appreciate that.
clown world outside, but even amongst the people that we respect as mutuals online, like prolific creators. A lot of those people aren't living the truth fully, or they have massive categories that they're just not representing themselves, not owning their full truth. And it's like I've my word for 2024, which we've now exited, was courage and sharing like the fullness of my story. Like speaking, the Latin root is like to speak one's heart fully.
Of courage?
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah, super cool. Like core. And I just think it's like lacking in our space, like people willing to embody that full depth of authenticity. Because it is scary, like they're sharing certain things this year, especially opening up about like previous disordered eating and some of this like more sensitive stuff. Approaching it is very daunting, but having stepped through it, like the freedom that you feel on the other side of that and being fully aligned with truth, like you feel impenetrable.
Yeah.
Because I think when you lean into it, even like the head shave thing, for instance, like people can clown you for a bad hairline, but like they won't clown you for like a shaved head.
Yeah, for going all in.
You're just that guy.
Yeah. You build a brand, dude.
Exactly. And like that's like it's a stupid example, right? Like it's just like an aesthetic change. It's not that deep. But it's an example of like, I think when you take full ownership of what's going on in your reality, you unlock like a deep superpower, which I think is like connected to the divine. And I know you talk a lot about that. I'm curious, I don't think we've ever gone into this. Like, what is your stance on or current belief set about like God and religion?
It's a great question. So first off, it's interesting to hear you say courage. I mentioned it to you earlier. I just finished an essay today by Ralph Waldo Emerson it's titled Courage. And if you haven't read it, and anybody that's listening, I cannot recommend it enough. That guy is an American icon, and it's a super insightful essay. But to your question, I'm reading a book right now on Ben Franklin, and so
Is it the Walter Isaacson?
Yeah,
Nice.
Benjamin Franklin, a life, and I'm parsing out. Like I'm very much so. I'm aligned with Ben Franklin in the sense that I don't like dogma. I'm averse to dogma. I don't particularly care for making a supplemental thing the main thing. And so I grew up in a Christian household, going to Southern Baptist Church literally 3 minutes. That way I could probably throw a rock. And I loved it. I thought it was great. Like we were part of the church. We would go on Wednesdays. We'd go on Sundays. In college, I really got into it, into like FCA and to some other, I can't remember what it was called, like that type of stuff in college. But as I started questioning more things, and I had a couple things in my life happen that I perceived as like core truths that ended up not being true, and that sort of like opened up some.
If you're comfortable sharing, what would be like an example of that?
Well, namely my girlfriend in high school and college ended up cheating on me, and that was the first time. Jordan Peterson talks about this, but like, I mean, marriage was very much so a part of the question. Like I was, like we were talking about earlier, young from the South, Southern Baptist. I'm like, yeah, I'll get married at like 21, 22. That sounds great. So that was very much so part of the question. And love, like that love that I had for her and that she had for me, like it was as true as this chair, this fire, us sitting down. And that, this is not in a malevolent way. Like I don't have any malice towards her at all. But for that to be, to peer into the fact that, oh wait, this thing that I perceived as 100% true, the love that we shared, it actually wasn't as true as I perceived it. That was the first time that I started questioning other things. I'm like, okay, well, what else is that I'm like perceiving as 100% true that is not necessarily true? And it opened up, I was already a curious person, but like it opened up curiosity about religion and things like that. All that to say, that was sort of the inflection point where I stopped blindly accepting or following everything. And it's not like I completely dispelled my childhood or Christianity in general, but it opened up my eyes to exploring further and questioning deeper. All that to say, Benjamin Franklin, it's really interesting because the first part of this book talks a lot about it. He grew up in like puritanic Philadelphia, Boston area. Like Puritans were very much so dogmatic in a lot of ways. And he hated it. He was like, he didn't get it at all. He was much more utility driven. His idea was that God's the pinnacle of divinity for human is doing well for man, like doing well to a fellow man. So he's like
Being useful,
exactly. Being useful in a positive way to your fellow man is divine, is something that he would have said. And so that kind of opened my eyes. I'm like, okay, well, if somebody's doing well to another person, I don't know. You're opening up a can of worms, because there's like, there's however many religions in the world, however many billions of them people prescribe or subscribe to each religion. I have a hard time believing that
somebody's got the right answer.
Somebody's got the right answer. And I saw this quote though. I'm like, well, the quote was like, the man who can say with certainty that he is correct is a genius. And I'm like, yeah, it's nuanced in this way. But all that to say, I'm very much so, I believe in Jesus. I believe Jesus was a real person who walked this earth and lived a perfect life. I believe that following Jesus and his teachings is a way to, unquestionably live a good life as a human being, to become useful to other human beings. But the actual intricacies in terms of like the dogma that comes along with like organized religion and stuff, I'm just not sold on it. I could very well change, and time will tell, but I don't know if that answers your question. I'm very much so open to continue exploring and finding the truth.
Well, I mean, I want to commend you on the fact that you're doing the work. Like, you're actually sussing it out. Like, you're searching for truth and nothing else. Like, you're actually just looking for truth. And I think the willingness to admit I don't know, but I'm looking for it, is to be admired and platformed more, because I think not enough people are. And part of the reason I prompted is a conversation I had last night for New Year's Eve, as well as very recently. One of my 2024 goals was to read the Bible for the first time, the whole thing, because I too was raised in a Christian household, Christian education as well, private Christian education. So plenty of Bible verses memorized, plenty of classes gone to, but never actually just read the Bible without somebody telling me what it's supposed to mean. And so I just kind of wanted to sort it out. And I laid out my experience in a podcast recently, and the unbelievable vitriol in the comment section, it's still on YouTube. People can go read those comments from Christians. It is laughable and like somewhat disappointing and sad to me a little bit, because I think they're missing the forest for the trees, even in just what I intended for the podcast. I mean, I don't know if they listened to the first 15 minutes. Like, I was just outlining, like, I just wanted to see what I found in the book. And I'm getting all these lessons on not interpreting the proper exegesis. Not everyone can just decide what the Bible means for them, yada, yada, yada. But I, too, have this intuitive, deep resistance towards dogma. And I think that is something that is inbuilt in us for a reason. Like, I think the idea of being sovereign, like your deep desire to be free and unburdened by the shackles of man in general, right? Like, financially, at a job, all these things, like, they're deeply interlinked. And I think whatever you end up constellating for your own faith practice, it must be representative of that. And so to assume that you're going to find, like, essentially like a perfect puzzle piece that you can plug in, and it's just like, this is all of the answers, it's the only right answer, everyone is wrong, and this giant eternity levying claim is 100% accurate. It's almost like too good to be true. And I think for somebody like yourself, like, you kind of have this insatiable desire to be curious, and having just like gone down the rabbit holes of all the different stuff, like ancient text, historicity, what's really going on in like the first century around that time, like the powers that be, etc. There's only so many things that you can learn and then actively or willfully deny. So it's cool to see you on your journey, and I think it's again, like the most important thing to terminate in is like, what is the fruit it's bearing in your life? If you believe in the teachings of Jesus Christ and it bears beautiful fruit, like you have amazing relationships with yourself and then with your loved ones around you, you have a strong community, you seem to be spiritually grounded, you're peaceful, you're calm, you're not easily caught into the clown world nonsense that's going on, then I could never walk up to somebody and say like your faith is wrong, or like you're somehow praying to the wrong God at night. Like,
well, that would be you doing the exact same thing that somebody in these comments are doing.
Exactly, and that's the kind of almost like deeply tragic thing is I think they're kind of very close to the truth in the fact that like I do think Jesus was tremendously based, and like his teachings, if you just take it on, there's like a category of Christian called like the red letter Christians, like the people who essentially only follow the red letters of the Bible, like Jesus's quotes. I think many people would be well served to like revisit a lot of what he said as the central focus, because to contrast it to this, I have a good friend, one of the friends actually I'm going to be living with in Miami. He's raised in a very traditional Catholic family, and they, as far as the fruit of their family, amazing, like such a warm home, little kids running around everywhere, multiple generations of people like living together. It's like beautiful. So like I cannot deny the fruit that is true in their life, but they're very much like to the T, the liturgical, the whole thing.
Yeah.
Saints, archbishop, one of them's becoming a priest, like declaring celibacy, the whole thing. Yeah. His younger brother. And so we're sitting around the fire last night discussing things, and I'm kind of like the outsider ideologically, so like they're just kind of poking and prodding, like, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? All very curiously, and I'm laying it out, you know, like I'm somebody who kind of, I own my truth and speak from the chest, and I have very strong thoughts about like first century Christianity and what I believe the Catholic Church is, and so I was kind of just like laying it out. And one of the older brothers who's married, has kids, whatever, he's like, yeah, I respect all that stuff, but like I'm at the place in my life where like most of it simply won't matter. Like I got kids to raise. I've made my decision on what I think is true. If somebody says something contradictory, I'm choosing actively to reject it. And I've just set the boundaries, and I had to respect that heavily. I was just like, owning that boundary. Yeah. I think it almost serves more strength, especially with self-awareness. Like you're aware of the concept that you're just like putting up this boundary. Like I'm not going to wander deep into the rabbit hole.
It's a left curve. It's left curving it. Are you familiar with that?
Yes. Yeah. The midwit meme might be the most true.
It's true in every single thing. There's truth in that. Like the decision, okay, I have fully, it's the decision, which is a very potent, powerful thing, is to decide. And I have nothing but complete respect for that. 100% I admire, like, I think it's a fantastic thing to do, to make the decision and then have your world unfold based on that decision and live and die by it. It's where I don't want to get caught is the middle. I don't want to mid-curve myself. Yeah. Which is a dangerous game. But an example I use is like I've hunted my whole life, and we have a hunting lease in Central Georgia, and just being exposed to like Southern people, like truly Southern people, like Southern Georgia
classic
folks.
Americana.
Yeah, exactly. Like left curving in the sense that like they don't really like it. I know people that just genuinely don't care about.
They'll never read Nietzsche.
Yeah, exactly. But which is great. Like they don't need it. Like, and exactly to your point, the fruit, you'll know a tree. Jesus said this. You'll know a tree by its fruit, by the fruit that it bears. And I think that's extremely true. Back to the Benjamin Franklin idea of utility. It's like, how useful is it? Well, is your belief and your community and your tribe's belief causing everybody to commit mass suicide by taking cyanide? Okay, well, it's not a very fruitful, not a very fruitful belief. So I'm going to go ahead and chalk that one off as an L. If it's producing a loving, caring, principled home,
Army.
Yeah, seriously, with principled young men, principled young women, love, and utility to your community, then I think you'd be a fool to deny that person the how would you say it? You'd be a fool to deny them that ability to decide and say that it's false.
Or dismiss it as non-truth.
Yeah.
I think what's lost on a lot of people is that belief is a tool. It is a technology. We get to aim it at the things that make our life better. For instance, like the you've probably seen like just waking up and saying I'm him. This idea that like waking up and choosing to believe that you're that guy. Does it have to be true? Could we make a comparison that some other guy is probably more him than you? For sure. Like there's taller guys, there's more jacked guys, he has more money, he has a better job. But if you wake up and embody that sense of like radical confidence, your life will improve. I also choose to believe every time I eat food, it's to the empowerment of my body. I'm going to be stronger, more jacked, more healthy, more wealthy. The more sun I get, the wealthier I become. These sorts of things that you just choose to believe, aiming your tool, the technology of belief at that thought or that idea, can bear fruit in your life. And we know from like parapsychology, whatever, like our beliefs deeply inform how we experience our reality. I was talking to my mom about this morning, actually, like this idea that like two people can go through an experience, the exact same material experience, the same quote unquote reality, completely different stories that they tell themselves. And what's nuts is we now know that it also deeply impacts like their physiology, their psychology differently. People can store trauma from an event, and another person can walk away deeply empowered by an event.
Mm-hmm.
And the event itself didn't change. So what does this tell us? Like, what you choose to believe matters tremendous amount, and it should always be taken back to the razor. Like, what fruit is it bringing in my life? Does this belief serve me actively? If not, I have the ability to discard it or adopt a different belief. And it's like the phrase that I think Chris Williamson got popular, which is not his, it came from somebody else, but the idea of like firm beliefs loosely held is better than loose beliefs firmly held. And that's something which I will call out the Christian audience in general. It's like most people simply just have not put their beliefs under any amount of rigor. Like I can ask them very basic questions about like Genesis or something, just having read the book myself, and they haven't. And there's kind of this like vitriolic, firm response from them. But when I ask them to articulate it, it's just this loosely formed jargon. Like they don't actually know what they believe, but they're militantly holding it on.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's harm. That's the dogma that hurts us, as opposed to a firm belief where I'm choosing to believe this, like my friend stated, like these are the boundaries and I'm choosing to believe it. But unlike him, I suppose, like if presented with conflicting evidence, I am willing to change my position. I think that serves us a lot more. And I was even thinking about, it's like the antithesis of life is stagnation and death. What does that look like in the realm of ideas? So like the physical body, when you're alive, vitality is represented in kinetics. Like you're moving around, you're vital. You can tell that there's life on like an energetic level down to the cell. It's like vibrating, right? And when you die, there's a calcification process. The body becomes stiff, you decay. Ideas, I think, are very much the same thing. And what we want to avoid is that calcification, the place you get to where your mind has hardened. It is literal intellectual death. So I hope for myself that I don't become that jaded old man that's just like, I already read all the books when I was young, and I came to this place where I believe something. Like I hope I can be reading some profoundly different piece of philosophy or ideology way later in life and be able to take it on and like hold two ideas in my head and I don't know, be compelled by them. Which brings me to something I do want to bring up on this podcast, because I know we said we were going to talk about it, and I think it's a super interesting conversation. In the pursuit of truth, I think we often find sometimes, I guess, disappointing facts about some of the people we've potentially venerated in the past. We both have a deep respect for the great men of history. You've started now a series on your podcast or where you're sitting down reading books about the great men of history and kind of articulating your thoughts and notes about that. And I too greatly admire these characters, like a Benjamin Franklin, a George Washington, Napoleon, Alexander, the list goes on. But as someone who is kind of very tinfoil hatty, truthy, I indulge in the rabbit holes. You end up finding out that a lot of these people might be tied to not so savory groups of people, potential occult practices, may have been more malevolent than meets the eye. So I'm curious for yourself, as someone who also is a truth respecter, how do you, in your head, deal with that? Like, I want to see this person as a symbol, but they also might have been potentially to say it loosely, like a bad guy.
Yeah.
And we can talk about Rockefeller specifically, but that could be a good example to use. I'll just open that floor to you. Like, where does that sit for you?
There is this idea that if you dive into, this is the interesting thing about Jesus, for example. Perhaps other than Jesus, if you dive into the life of any human being that's ever lived and you didn't find something that was, quote, bad or malevolent in some way, I would say you're not looking hard enough. Myself included, like, I go through life with this paradigm that nobody is perfect. I believe that fully. And I think that's part of why we are spiritual beings or worshiping beings. Like we want to perceive something as perfect. That's like God's role, like the Heavenly Father, like this perfect being. No man has ever walked this earth, other than Jesus, in my opinion, that if you got so granular and microscopic with the information that we have, that is not bad, if that makes sense. So John D. Rockefeller is a great example. That was so far I've done Teddy Roosevelt, John D. Rockefeller, Alistair Urquhart, Ernest Shackleton, and then Ben Franklin now. And I mean, obviously you and I have both done research in the past on other guys, but John D. Rockefeller, let's use that as an example. He was, at the time, probably the richest person that ever one of the richest person that ever existed, probably the most wealthy businessman that ever existed. He grew up extremely poor with a bigamist father who was a con artist essentially. And he firmly believed, talk about belief, he believed that his role in life, God put him on this earth to accumulate as much material wealth as humanly possible so that he could then give away as much as he possibly could. That said, he created, I don't even know, probably hundreds of thousands of jobs that allowed people to pay. Here's what we'll do. We're going to transition this to the CEO guy, the United Healthcare CEO.
Oh, wow.
I was having this conversation with somebody.
YouTube.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we'll keep it high level.
We'll keep it in.
This guy, I heard somebody speak about how this guy's a bad guy because like the things that his company that he was in control of was doing. Totally understand. I'm not here to argue that I really don't like the healthcare system. But the other thing, you have to take both sides of the coin. I think there's 440,000 people that are employed by that company. That's 440,000 people that earn an income that allow them to pay for their family's food, their family's housing, their family's life, their family's education, etc. All that to say, I just think that it's nuanced in that way. John D. Rockefeller, back to him. If I took everything that he said or did and hold it up as truth, that would be dogmatic in my opinion. That would be another form of dogma. My friend Noah Heisman said, I don't know if it's his quote, but he said to me, wisdom is the ability to entertain an idea without accepting it. And so, taking a character like John D. Rockefeller, I think we would be foolish to not learn what we can learn from the richest businessman that ever existed to his time, that was started off dirt broke. I think we'd be fools not to try to find pieces that we can implement into our own life, and then just write him off as, oh, well, we can't look into him or study him or find any positive or redeeming traits because he was potentially or maybe not even potentially a part of things that we don't agree with, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think I agree with your position, which is like there's something to be learned from everyone, even some of the most malevolent. And like I don't know that him outright would be the most malevolent person I could conjure to mind. I can think of far worse individuals throughout history, both past and present. But to your point, like there are nuggets of truth sprinkled throughout all walks of life and also all like texts and whatever. Like if you're looking for truth, you can find it in many places. So I think it's important to have that kind of caveat. I guess the question I wrestle with specifically, and this can even tie back into like your opinion on like morality as well, is like where do you draw the line? Because for you you have to make that decision, right? Like there is some line in your head, and the United Healthcare is like a great example. Like what I would push back on is like, yes, 400 and whatever thousand people are employed, and that's excellent, and I'm sure they're all hardworking individuals, living normal, standard American lives, like with kids, like not concerned with what we're even discussing here at all. They're just out there doing their thing. So I don't want to drag them in, but like if we're doing sort of a trolley problem, like evaluation of utility, the low end of the estimates of the death toll for the jab in 2020 is at 500,000, and the high end worldwide would be like 17 million. So, you know, genocide has been committed by these types of organizations.
Talk about YouTube, bro.
I know. It's like ongoing. We'll see if it gets
Yeah.
in. Like the Soul Bra pod already got ripped.
Sorry to interrupt.
No. It's important to note. We are in clown world. But it's like, yeah, like where do you draw the line? Like who would you? Because you're also, I think what's important too with like studying this stuff is you're essentially like taking psychic company with these people. Like if you read somebody's writings or books, like you're spending hours at a time, you're allowing them into your mind palace. Mm-hmm. And that's a sacred space, you know, like you have to set up walls. Like, and I would imagine you would probably be averse to studying. I mean, maybe not. I don't want to speak for you. Yeah, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do.
I didn't land on a great question.
No, I see.
Apologize,
well, where do I draw the line?
Yeah.
And what came to my head is Mao Zedong.
I was gonna say Mao. That's crazy. Yeah.
As far as I understand, is responsible for more directly attributable deaths to his leadership than any human being that's ever lived. I think it's like 100 million people that were like directly contributed to him being in leadership. If I'm not mistaken, he wrote a book. I wish I could look this up. I don't want to. I believe that he wrote a book on military strategy and military tactics and things like this. I want to say it's called the Little Red Book. Somebody quote check me or fact check me. I could be conflating two things, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. Assuming that is the case, that book has been read by many military leaders throughout the world that have used that information to win battles for good.
Maybe.
Well, yeah, you're exactly right. Good, bad, but that's the line. I feel like with the question, where do you draw the line? That leads to decision. Like you, at some point, you kind of just have to decide because, as you said, well, what is a good war? Is there actually any holy wars? Is there any wars that were technically quote benevolent?
Right.
That's a whole other question and can of worms. But the idea is like, okay, this guy that's attributed to killing so many people, has created this thing, or let's say created this thing that informed other people who, at least in their heart, were using that information to create good in the world. So it's an interesting thing. I will, to answer your question, I will chalk that up to God. I have faith that God is going to allow me and give me prudence and discernment in what I'm taking in and what I'm learning from those lessons. I believe that his hand is in my studies, because if I don't believe that, honestly, then like to your point, like where is the line? So I believe that he will give me the prudence and the discernment to understand what to take from a guy like, I haven't read about Mao Zedong or like John D. Rockefeller. Like, okay, well, maybe don't do like cultish things. Probably don't start pharmaceutical companies. Probably like all these things. Like, okay, don't do those. But in terms of, hey, building a business, use these things. Leading people, use these things. That's the answer. I believe that God has a hand in giving me prudence and discernment in those things.
It's a great answer. I think it literally, like, it has to terminate there in faith in God and then walking in lockstep, because a very similar question to what we're kind of describing is like with the question of epistemology in general. In like studying all this stuff, you can just keep going back and like, well, is that a fake text? Is this a psyop within a psyop? How do we know what is true? Like, how do we know that our knowledge in the first place is right? The ideas themselves. And it essentially becomes near impossible. And I've asked two people I respect about this, and Dustin Thomas being one of them.
Oh, he's a G, dude. I've never got to connect with him, but he's a G.
Yeah, Dustin, we're still trying to sort the podcast out, but I got to do a brief Twitter space with him, and it was basically just me and him, John, back and forth. And I kind of posed this question, like, how do you know when you're going through And similarly, I posed it to Pat Moyse in kind of the studying things like mysticism and the occult. How do I know that I'm not accidentally going to run into like practices of the bad guys, right? Because we know that Satan or evil is the great deceiver. It's always going to look and feel comfortable and could theoretically tempt you in. And both of their answers were you have to trust your intuition, like radically, your inner knowing. You will simply just know. And I think that when you are allied with truth and when you're allied with God, it doesn't become this kind of quantifiable, well, Zach, I draw the line at somebody who's killed under 500,000 people or whatever, right? Like it's not going to be some sort of thing. Your razor is not going to be a math statement. It's not going to be an equation. It's more of, I know that this isn't going to hurt me because God's got me and mine. You know, I can take what is positive, and because I know internally that I'm in the service of good and I'm only looking to do good with this information, it's not going to hurt anyone else either. And so I think
that's what faith is, really.
Exactly. And I think it takes radical faith arguably to exist as a human being, whether it's conscious or unconscious. I think most people live unconsciously, taking acts of faith, like, for instance, the sun will rise tomorrow. You're not going to get in a car accident when you get in a car, these types of things. Like, our reality is by nature extremely uncertain. And so I think we act on faith all the time. And I think making that radical extension to like relinquishing the wheel entirely and like dangling off that edge is so much freedom is there. And I've like only leaned more and more into that in my life. And when I made the leap to like step into entrepreneurship and like burn the boats, quit my job, that whole thing, I added on my pendant. I've since kind of evolved from that season of my life, but the tarot card, which is like the story of the tarot deck, is the Fool. And in the picture of the tarot Fool, it's this kind of like jester character, and he's standing on the edge of a cliff, like wistfully looking up at the stars, like smiling, but he's like right at the edge of a cliff. And the idea is that you have this kind of like youthful naivete, that it's just going to be okay. And that's how you survive. Like the story of the tarot is the fool going through life. And it's like a metaphor or a symbolic representation of man's path. And the more that I've leaned into that just like radical, childlike, naive trust, it's only been magically sent back in positive ways. And again, to the statement of like belief is a technology, I'm choosing to believe it, and it's making my life better.
Yeah.
It's like I have no reason not to. And the world definitely pushes back on it. People who have, conflicting worldviews or have lived a more jaded experience, they're like, oh, wait till you have kids, wait till you have blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I just don't see it the same. It doesn't have to be the same.
Yeah.
My reality is dictated by what I believe, and that hasn't been disproven yet. So I have no reason to believe it won't be true in the future. But yeah, hopefully that was helpful for people, because I think a lot of people that listen to my podcast are likely interested in like they're deeply curious individuals. I think the same thing for people that are listening to yours. And I think it's hard to wrestle with some of these like bigger ideas, like the potentiality that like there are no heroes. It's very much like a black pill. And yeah. I think with your brand, like, and just what we're seeing in general with like masculinity and actual values.
I'm listening. I'm gonna throw some more wood on this fire.
No, you're good. It's important that we do have symbols. Like Noah, your friend you mentioned, I know he wrote a book about
phenomenal
heroes.
Incredible book. Incredible.
Which I haven't read yet, and I want to have him on the podcast, so I'll probably talk to you about that after this. But just that idea, like that we need, humans are intrinsically story-driven. We need stories to rally ourselves around, and heroes. And when we lack that character in our existence, we stray and we struggle. And it's why the religion thing I think is super important too. Like you could argue the past 2,000 years, the character that has dominated the psychological zeitgeist is Christendom, like the story of Christ. And that's an interesting one. Like what stories were foregone and subverted or replaced with the story of Christ. And what stories can we look back and go find? The stories of Hercules and Odin and Achilles and so many of the great stories that are deeply captivating and like captured me as a child. I think there's no like coincidence there. And I think similarly with like Americana and like modern stories, like it's important that we look at guys like George Washington and Teddy Roosevelt as like gangsters and badasses and symbols and icons of values that we can venerate, if nothing more than just symbolic. Like, just take them for what they are. Like,
Yeah.
They don't exist anymore. They're dead and gone.
In a mythical way.
Literally, like mythologize them.
Yeah, that's what Noah would say. Noah would say, like Abe Lincoln, for example, that he has become a mythological figure, for lack of a better term. So that's interesting. It's
super interesting. And a recent thing that I've been really fascinated by is this idea that myth and history are more of the same than they are separate, and potentially completely inverted, in that the myths that we're told are actually our history, and the history we've been given is a complete whole cloth fabrication. Yeah. And in the case of like ancient history, for instance, I think that there's a strong case to be made, and there's a few YouTubers that I've had this idea kind of like given to me or suggested. Figures like Minerva, like Athena, and Hercules very well may have been just extremely impressive individuals that through the sands of time, their stories became more and more mythologized until the point of deification. Mm-hmm. And then they became added to the pantheon. And I think there's like a great case for this. Like, for instance, when Christendom entered the pagan world into like the Celts and the Germans, they were very strong people, extremely sturdy in not only physiology but belief. Mm-hmm. And so when, the friars rocked up and they're like, we have this guy Jesus, like they couldn't just wholesale cut down the trees and the shrines. It was more so, and we have evidence now in some of the old writings and like art, that a lot of these, pagan cultures actually just adopted Christ into their pantheon as another god, or as another
deity.
Pagan deity that they would worship and venerate as like a strong individual within their frameworks. I think that's a really interesting way to look at history. It's also a very useful way to actively think about your own history, like constellating your own path, like who you choose to venerate or believe have deep virtues. Like, why not?
Yeah.
Like,
well,
go ahead.
Noah, first off, I think you all have a fascinating conversation, but Noah had this idea that, or maybe it wasn't Noah. It was in our conversation, but he talk about a guy who he's read so much and so well read, he can rip off so many. But the idea of like a hero being the ideal, that center force, the idea that show me a culture's heroes and I will show you the morality or the virtues of the cultures or the lack thereof, for example. So he relayed to me this quote, or this study. Actually, it's in his book, History of a Hero. That said, if you ask like a 13-year-old right now or something in America, like who your heroes are, some crazy percentage of them answered like some YouTuber, influencer or something like that. And that's like, okay, that's pretty informative, right? Like, who are we hoisting or pedestalizing? That's a pretty important place in culture. Like, who are we looking up to? Because it is the ideal. It's like the thing that we're aspiring to. And to think about like some influencer being that guy, that's a little bit concerning for me. But it's an interesting question. I think myth is a very misconstrued thing in the modern context. Most people, if you ask, and I've had conversations about this, you hear myth and you're like, oh, that's like it's fake, it's fabricated. Yep. Exactly. But I'm of the belief that myth is actually the most true thing.
Yes.
Myth is the most, and here's an example. Across every single culture that has ever existed that can write or draw or speak has either conjured up or relayed stories of a figure with a similar path, the hero's journey. Literally, I won't say every single one, the overwhelming majority. These are
high consciousness cultures.
Yes, these are cultures that have that are distanced by time, distanced by geography, distanced by language, distanced by tradition and societal values. They have these same stories, and so to me, that story is more true than me and you sitting here right now. Like that's speaking to something in us. That's why we watch these movies as kids that were like Hercules. That's why we're like, oh my gosh, Hercules is so cool. He did this thing, or Jesus, or even athletes, like these athletes that go through this hero's journey, we pedestalize them for a reason because they're our ideal, they're the thing that we aspire to. And I think it's very important, as you said, similar to what you're talking about reading and who I'm letting into my mental palace, like who are we placing, what figures are we placing at that prominent position? I think that's a very important thing for each of us to ask ourselves. And I think it's indicative of a culture at large who sort of the vast majority of the culture sort of places or gets placed in that position. I think it's indicative of a lot of things.
And I don't want to be dismissive of our boy JC, but besides Jesus, who would you say is your paragon? Who is the aspirational figure for you? Modern or ancient?
That's a really good question.
Like when you think of the Ubermensch, like your idea of like the guy.
I'm fascinated by what I know of the story of Hercules, with Arete and Cacaia, virtue and vice, entering into his life after he committed a grave sin. And his journey. I think that there's a lot of the crossroads that he was at, like the literal crossroads that he had, I think is very relatable to pretty much every decision that you and I and any human makes. It's a really good question. I think the knights, Noah talks a lot about the knights that were the round table and how they were sort of his book History of a Hero, I'll speak on that for a second. So he goes through like all of the heroes that have sort of influenced Western society. So he starts with the Greek, Rome, then he goes to Roman, then he goes to Judeo-Christian, and then like Beowulf, and then the Knights of the Round Table. The Knights of the Round Table are interesting because they're the, other than Jesus, they're probably the most like holistic in a way. Like they're the chivalrous, but they're also the brave. So they're like this wholehearted masculinity where they can like hold a baby, but then also go defend a castle type stuff. In terms of actual human beings that lived, I am very much so drawn to Teddy Roosevelt. I have been for a long time. He had this idea. He was a romantic in the truest sense, and I wrote a newsletter about this a while ago. But he firmly believed in the idea that a human being had the power to positively influence his neighbor and his community, which I think is a very important thing to realize. He lived very much so a non-traditional life in the sense that the amount of things that guy did. He wasn't. I mean, he lived a full life. He lived a strenuous life, is what he would coin it. Actually, he was in the arena as one of first topics of conversation that we ever had. He was the
intro and outro of the pod,
the coiner of that phrase, more or less, or the patron saint of that idea. So Teddy Roosevelt for sure. And then Matthew McConaughey has this idea. Have you heard him speak about heroes?
I'm sure I've seen clips. I personally don't see McConaughey as much of a philosopher.
No. So not Matthew McConaughey as a hero, but he has this idea of like his hero being himself 10 years down the line.
Ah, yeah.
Like this figure, this ideal that he is aspiring to, this person that is virtuous to a higher degree than he is now, and he's aspiring to continue growing and to exude and live by those types of virtues. So that's a really good question. I actually haven't thought about it much. And what I'll do is actually go think about that and spend some more time, because that's a really insightful question. But yeah, I would say Jesus 100%, just by the way I was raised and what I know and believe to be true about him. Hercules is fascinating to me, the Knights, and then Teddy Roosevelt.
All very strong answers, and all like super, super compelling stories.
What about you? Any off the top of your head?
I think I was always deeply captured by like the Greek mythology. So, characters like Perseus and Achilles, Hercules, those types of archetypes. And then now I've recently gotten a lot more into the idea of race and heritage, and within paganism, like the kind of principal idea is that like you believe what your ancestors believed because your ancestors believed it, and you venerate your ancestors as gods. So I've been trying to tether myself and do more research into like who I am and where I came from. What's really cool is we have the Schenken family goes back to this tiny town in Germany called Kedlenburg, and we were one of the 5 founding families of Germany. The first time Germany became a country in about 1000. Year 1000. Wow. Yeah, there's a tiny little town.
That's strong.
Super cool, like founder energy. Like it's amazing that we still have like the path back. But to think like, where does that group of people come from? Like Germania, ancient whatever, like Hyperborean DNA, whatever. And tethering to some of that energy. And like I never was captured by the Norse stories. I just wasn't really presented with them. But I do resonate a lot with like the concept of an all-father god like Odin. His story's super interesting. Also the fact that like he sacrificed himself to himself to access the runes. Super cool story, kind of like Christ-ish energy, as far as like the ultimate sacrifice. So I've been going down that more recently. But yeah, I think like the Greek myth, just super compelling. And I'm kind of like circling back around, which is why I kind of press on the Christianity thing. And I do want to ask you, like, you say like living a virtuous life. What are maybe like your top 3 virtues that you like believe in that are virtuous?
Top 3 virtues that I believe in. Number 1, I think it is integrity, and by integrity I mean
congruency with your word.
Congruency with your word.
Yeah.
The idea that we've spoke about this probably numerous times, probably on your appearance on my podcast, but the idea that the word is an important thing, and it was in John, I think.
Yeah.
It's the first thing.
The prelude.
So yeah, I think a man's word is extremely important, and I do my best and will continue to increase the threshold of that best to live up to my word, to speak what I believe and live by those words. So integrity, which I would tie like truthfulness and honesty under integrity, living in integrous, however that word would be, life. Integrity. I don't know if industry would be a right one, but I'm reading Ben Franklin. It's top of mind. But the idea of like utility, like being useful to my community. Usefulness would be one, I guess. Positive utility. In the sense that, sort of with the romantic idea, like I as an individual can either make the lives of my community worse or better. And so the utility aspect of that, I think that's a virtue. Third, I would say humility, in the sense that it's interesting because there's this, it's very much so modern, like I think modern Christianity, one of the things they get wrong is like the glorification or the overestimation of humility, in the sense of like passivity and lack of ability. Really, it's like lack of competence in a lot of ways.
Self-cucking.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. The idea that Jordan Peterson said this as well, but like the idea that a good man is not a harmless man. A good man is a man that's very dangerous, that has it under control. One of the most instrumental verses in my entire life, Matthew 10:34. It changed my perception on Jesus. It changed my perception on Christianity in general, and it's been very prevalent in my life. It's Jesus is speaking, red letters. He says, "Do not believe that I've come to bring peace. I do not come to bring peace, but a sword." And so the idea of like, I was listening to Jesus say that. I'm like, wait, my whole life I thought Jesus was like this namaste, sort of like turn the cheek, be cool.
Yeah,
I'm like, dude, he's saying he brings a sword. What the hell does that even mean? But the idea of humility, that was a little bit of a tangent, but the idea of humility in the sense that I am not God. I am not the creator of the universe, but I am created by the creator of the universe, and I'm made in his image. And another verse, 2 Timothy 1:7, which is another favorite verse of mine, is God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and self-control. It's not like, I don't believe that it's my spirit or like me individually. I believe it's like, I don't know if it's given to me by God. The spirit that I have is given to me by God. And so humility, in the sense that I need that spirit, if that makes sense. Humility.
Maybe like an understanding of where you sit in a hierarchical structure, where you are below the creator, like you are in service of something more vertical than yourself.
Yes,
potentially.
Exactly. That's a really good way to put it. But yeah, that's these are all really good questions, and I appreciate you asking them, because when you have to answer them off the cuff like this, you have to sort of get down to brass tacks. You have to really, what am I going to say? You know, I don't have time to sort of scratch out this line because I don't like it.
You can't make the cool answer.
Exactly. You have to kind of, this is off the cuff. So I appreciate. There's the refinement of candor, meaning like the refinement process of not being able to think about it.
Yeah.
It kind of, you have to refine your answers to what you actually
it's
believe.
why, like, I have a closer question, which you're probably familiar with just because you know my stuff, but like, it's why I don't prep people for those, because one of them, I'll give you the spoilers, like, what's a quote that is always stuck with you or you choose to live by. And while I think it is cool to like think of the coolest quote possible that like encapsulates your philosophy, whatever, if it isn't possible for you to conjure it up in the moment, then that's not your quote. The quote is the one that literally comes to top of mind when I say the words. And that's what's deeply embedded in you and deeply embedded in your reality. And maybe it's colored by the conversation. Maybe it's colored by, oh, we talked about this, so it's top of mind. But like, quite frankly, the here and now is reality anyway. So that's why I like to like hit people on the spot. And also pushing you just as an accountability, like brother to brother. I think there's, even as you were discussing humility, you chose that word, but it seemed like you were edging towards the virtue of strength, being strong as a virtue, and not allowing yourself to be weak, because weak meaning dangerous to your others, not possible of service. And I think that is more ancestral to like where you and I came from. The pagans would have like venerated strength. You think about Achilles and these characters, right? And this was Nietzsche's critique in Genealogy of Morals. Like he was condemning the Judeo-Christian, which I kind of resent that phrase in general, zeitgeist that was happening, because everyone was, as we said, self-cucking. It was a poor interpretation of Christ himself, and it's more this like permanent genuflection, like I just need to be this meek little servant, and the highest thing that I can attain is just bending my knees and praying all day. And it's literally antithetical to the idea that like, no, it feels good to be strong. Like as a man, intuitively, what do you feel when you are a stronger version of yourself? When you submit somebody in jiu-jitsu, when you go in and hit a PR, when you make the most money you've ever made in business, when you can defend a girl that you love, you held her in your arms and you know that she's safe. Like these things are just intuitively true. And I think a lot of the Judeo-Christian rhetoric is antithetical to that. And being willing to kind of admit that to yourself, or like even just be aware of the potentiality there, I think is important. And like you said, words are important as well. So it's fun to play with. And I also think like, especially as we step towards the season of life where we'll be fathers and eventually like leading a family, one thing I'm working on is like, I want to write like a family constitution, so that like, it's not just this loose idea of like, we kind of believe in this stuff and it's just up to whatever. It's like, no, the Shanken name means this. These are our virtues, and this is what we stand for. So like, I'm trying to land on that word, and so like picking those words is important.
What does Shanken mean? Have you done the etymology on that, or the origination?
Yeah, so in German it means to gift or to give a gift. I'm still like doing historicity, like what was our role at the time. What's cool is I'm in a group chat, and there's a guy that lives in Germany, and when I mentioned I was from Kedlenburg, he's like, oh, I know where that is, and like. And he sent me all these like German Wikipedia articles, like all cool. Written in German, about like my family and kind of where it was from, like the best that he could find, because apparently it's a very uncommon name in Germany, which is why it like stuck out.
Interesting.
So it's potentially we were like the cupbearers at the time, and like on our crest that we've like received since then, there's like a dude holding a cup and holding there's like a book as well. So potentially like cupbearers, keeper of texts. Unclear. Yeah. And part of this too with the whole mythology thing is that I'm going to intentionally mythologize our family and our name, because the truth is like I might not be able to know exactly what we came from, but I do get to choose.
Yeah.
And then from there, we get to build this myth and this idea and like venerate our ancestry and have a family lineage and write about my father and like what he stood for. And then from him descended Zach, Nicholas, and Michael. And like, this is what our family's built. And we brought in these women from wherever. I think it's important. I think it's like deeply important. But yeah, I think that idea, like getting to the place where you can kind of stand, it's just a power that nobody wields. Like what do you believe? Like if you ask somebody that, best case scenario, they've chosen like a pre-packaged answer and can give you some like verses or whatever to point to. And at least in that case, it's something. Most of the time it's just like, yeah, like people our age, especially in Austin, like where you like live, like I believe in energies.
Yeah.
And it's like you're describing, it's the spiritual middle ground.
Yeah.
You're just somewhere under this giant bell curve and you are spiritually inept. Versus like if you have a razor, if you can say, I believe in truth, I believe in strength, I believe in beauty, whatever it is for you, you possess a tremendous amount of power, because all of that energy that is the human spirit is now funneled behind a very pointed arrow. And I think that's really compelling.
Do you know? So that's interesting. Decision. Do you know the etymology of decision? Decide.
You were the one who told me, actually.
To kill off. So belief is really a decision. It's a series of decisions, I guess you could say. And you're exactly right. When you decide, you do gain strength because then your energy is funneled. It's militaristically, Napoleon was a prime example of this. He would very rarely, if ever, divide his resources, his army. He would attack all of his power on one thing and then turn to the next. And that's a decision, because you could try to fight 4 armies at once. You could try to do 4 things at once. You could try to have 16 different beliefs, but then it's like you don't actually believe anything. See, it's sort of the idea that if everything's important, nothing is.
What's something that you've recently, I guess it doesn't even have to be recently, but what's a pretty impactful thing that you cut off that you feel like amplified your life in a meaningful way?
Something that I cut off that amplified my life in a meaningful way. I would say I make conscious decisions, and I don't mean this to be crass or rude. I am very much so the type of person, I value loyalty, I really do, but I'm also very much so the type of person that I believe in mimetic desire and the idea that we are in very meaningful ways influenced by who we surround ourselves with. So I won't say that I've actively like told people, hey, I'm cutting you off from my life. But there's people from high school, people from college, people from more recently that I've just decided not to
invest in,
have around. And that doesn't mean like sometimes people hit me up and I'll have conversations with them and whatnot, but it's like it's not this active investment in their life. And I sort of remove the ability for them to invest in mine. And so I'll say people, but not in like the way where it's like, oh, fuck these people, I'm cutting everybody out. I'm like, I don't really believe in that, because I also think that there's an element of compassion that needs to be had, that sometimes you have to be, Vance, who you know, he says like be a lighthouse, not a tugboat, or I can't remember what he says. No, be a tugboat or not a lighthouse. Nonetheless, like sometimes you are that thing, you can be that thing from a distance that people can look to. And I think that's been a massively impactful thing, because my friend group and my circle now is almost exclusively people that I'm like proud to be associated with and have a lot of respect and trust and care for, which I think, to your point about like decision, I don't think a lot of people do that. And I see it actually negatively impact people. And one of the things that I wish that I could give more pointed advice about to people in my life, and perhaps I should get better about this and articulating it in a caring way, is like encouraging people to refine the people that they're around. So yeah, I would say certain people.
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer, and probably something most people struggle with very critically, because like again we have fun, we dance in the realm of ideas and philosophy and whatever, but like brass tacks, how are you spending your day and who are you around, deeply meaningful. Obviously I don't want to like beat the drum of like you're the sum of the people you surround yourself with, but it is very true. We're deeply mimetic, we're deeply tribal, we're constantly essentially building a story of our lives, and these are the main characters. It's the cast in your story. And I do think we're in a society that like overly venerates the friendliness, just like being nice to people in general, at the sacrifice of really not standing for anything. Like, oh, I can be friendly with so and so, and it's kind of the same thing with like who you let into your mind palace. You have a finite amount of energy and attention to direct during the day, and if you entertain everything, you kind of will get nowhere and go nowhere because you're standing for nothing. And people are one of the biggest either energy givers or takers.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not even like necessarily a conscious parasite energy, but like to speak to someone and tap in with them and like respond to the text at all times, if they're not equally investing back, the willingness to be like, honestly, like, I think I'm gonna do me, and that's okay. Like, comma, that's okay.
Yeah, big comma, and it's not even that's okay. It's like that's good, because the other thing is addition by subtraction. I've noticed this before in my life. Maybe I'm not up to par. Maybe somebody needs to have that realization, like, oh, that person's not in my life anymore. Probably because like we're on diverging paths, and because I'm not up to par with the standard of the people that they want to be around. And that can be a fire under people's butts. I really do believe that. I think it can really incentivize and motivate people to be like, so for example, say you have a group of 10 friends, and then all of a sudden 7 of those friends are no longer in your life. There's this idea that if you meet an asshole, you met an asshole. If you met 2 assholes, you met 2 assholes. If you meet 3 assholes, you're the asshole.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's an insightful data point to understand who A, wants to be around you, and who chooses to be around you, and B, who you do vice versa. So, and I also think it's important in like this grind set culture nowadays. I think there's like this over romanticization of non cordial, like being non cordial at the to appear being strong. I don't think a lot of the people that I look up to, or that I've in these historical figures that we mentioned, I think that at large they were a lot of them were likable guys.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like they were like, hey, I'm not going to talk to you like you're a piece of crap. I'm not going to talk to you, you're a piece of crap. There's a time and place to be direct and forthright, and I think you should lead with that, but it's not a malicious, like my friends from high school or my friends from college that I no longer like am super actively involved with. It's not like, hey dude, I think you're a bad guy, I don't want to be like you, and I'm not going to hang out with you anymore. Yeah. It's not a malicious intent at all. It's sort of what you just said. It's like, I think that we're on different paths. At one point they were converging, but now they're going different areas, different places, and comma, that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's powerful. And I think like I'm like very big on like the Renaissance, right? It's like all this stuff terminates at the individual level, and interestingly, it really never ends up shaking out to like having a hard conversation or their opinion of you. It's really about, are you okay in your head? Have you given yourself permission to have made the decision, like you're saying, versus are you actually like quietly beating yourself up, like, oh, I really should reach out to so and so, or I feel bad because I haven't messaged, like we should probably hang out because I'm in town. And if you're just like constantly guilt tripping yourself, it's just like you're dragging around dead weight in your psychology for no reason.
On that note, I want to tie something back in from the beginning of the conversation. You said capital earlier in the context of money, in the sense that like living a non-traditional life, and it's like I think that's because people have asked me before, like, how's the podcast going, or like have you monetized it yet? That's usually the first question that people ask. I don't know if you can relate to that. They ask about money right away. I have answered many times, in every other way other than monetary, it has been a fruitful investment.
Yeah.
And so the idea that we have like capital is resource, really. It's not just money, it's time, it's energy. It's knowledge, it's everything. But to your point, it's also relationships. Relationship capital is a real thing. You only have so many. Dunbar number is what, like 150 in terms of
something like that.
Like people you can actually be familiar, like intimately know. You only have so many of those people. So if you've got like 15, 20, 30, 40 people that you're just kind of like not really jiving with, but you just kind of have in your life, and you're investing relationship capital into a sinking ship, I think that's a bad use of capital. And I'm more inclined to reinvest elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, surround yourself with only savages. I think like what's cool in social media is you kind of get like a literal Rolodex through your mutuals of like who you're choosing to keep in there. And if you're very strict with that, which I am, and I notice you follow like very few people as well, it's really cool, especially through podcasting, to start to, attain those mutuals, like people you respected, but now equally send respect back. And you're just like, wow, if I only had my mutuals and I had to start over from ground zero, like I'd be so sweet.
Mm-hmm.
And an additional encouragement I would offer to you, because I also get the same thing, and directly the podcast hasn't been monetized in the sense that I don't get advertising money, but it has brought me both capital through leads or whatever else. Even when the money isn't hitting the bank account, something I liked, I think I saw it from Jesse Eitzler, was like when he and his friends were broke and they were making mixtapes, like trying to figure it out, he would just scream, like when they were in the studio, "We're millionaires, they just haven't paid us yet." And I love that. Like
belief before ability.
You've made the money. Like your podcast has made money. I mean, I don't know how many episodes in. I think you might have passed. You're in the 80s or 90s or something.
94 will be my next one.
You made 94 podcasts. Like universal law of reciprocity. You've made money. Like the check hasn't hit. You haven't set up the funnel correctly. It's just not there yet. You've made money, brother. Like you've put so much life force, hours, and at least 94 hours into this thing. Like,
well over that.
Crazy to conceptualize,
sure.
but it's just an encouragement, because I know it is a deeply, at least at this point, it's comical. But like, yes, the normie mind often asks like, "How you doing with the thing? Have you made money yet?"
It's not like, it's funny because it's not like, have you had like cool conversation? What are you talking about? Who are you meeting?
What are you interested in?
Who are you learning from? What are you learning? It's almost exclusively, have you monetized? But I appreciate that encouragement. I think you're exactly right. That's do you listen to Founders podcast?
I have. I'm pretty selective because he makes so many.
He makes a lot.
But
talk about reciprocity. It took him 5.5 years before his podcast became.
That guy's
something.
A savage.
David Sinner is a savage.
Deserves everything he's gotten.
100%. Talk about providing value too. Like it's utility, and the idea that income is directly correlated, and actually not even directly correlated. It is, unless you're living in a conniving, like con artist way, your income is directly tied to the value that you're providing. And so that guy, for example, he's done 300 and whatever episodes on all these people. And one of the things that he's spoken about, and then in my own studies, I've started to see these through lines of belief coming before ability.
Yes.
There's this idea that you have to like build up, what's the word?
Evidence.
Yeah, you have to build up evidence. I don't particularly align with that. I think there's a balance to it. Like I don't think you can just completely negate the results that are coming into your life, but there is the idea that John D. Rockefeller, for example, when he was young, would tell people, "I'm going to be the richest person in the world. I'm going to be the richest person in the world." That's an outrageous thing for a young guy from a poor, bigamous family to say. Outrageous. But he believed it. And the ability basically conformed itself to that belief. So I appreciate that encouragement. I think that's really good.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on that point, because I've been such like a maximalist on that. And the zeitgeist narrative is opposite, especially with like Alex Hormozy, who, by the way, will be on the podcast and I respect deeply as like a philosophical mind. Super smart guy. But he's really big on the action. He's like hyper utilitarian in his philosophy. And he's like, just do the actions, get the evidence, and then that's your self-belief. Like self-belief basically doesn't exist. I completely reject that, only because the first action, where's your evidence? You have no evidence. Why are you doing it? You have no idea it's going to work. It literally is a prerequisite of taking the first action that you have belief that the action theoretically could give you the thing. And so I'm a big believer, like you said, like just radical self-belief, like just insane things. Like I just believe the world is going to pay me hundreds of thousands of dollars to do exactly what I'm put on earth to do. And I have no reason to not believe that.
Well, you got to believe something.
Exactly.
And you might as well believe something that's going to empower you. That's something that Andrew Tate, believe what you want about him, but like he said that one time where he's like, why would I believe something that makes me powerless? If I have the choice to believe something, why would I not just believe something that empowers me? So I agree with that completely.
100%. Well, this has been awesome. I don't know how far in we are, but I appreciate those that have made
125.
125. Right on the money. I think we could go all day. We have much to talk about off air as well. do you want to get into quickly? I do want to honor the space. Do you want to talk about what's coming up for you?
Sure.
With this
Yeah.
brand launch.
Well, I mean, yeah, we can go as long as you want, to be honest. But, yeah, Rough Rider. This is not why I came on the podcast.
No, but I think it's important because it's kind of tied into like creating a story, narrative, myth.
Yeah. So, and just the idea of surrounding yourself with people who are aligned, and the use of the proper use, the use of social media as a creation tool rather than a consumption drain. That's a paradigm that I like to live by, and I aspire to live more and more by, is creation over consumption. But I met two of my best friends in Austin in life through Instagram, and we've gotten to know each other very well, and we're aligned in a lot of ways, and we decided we're going to build a brand that is called Rough Rider, largely influenced by the life of Teddy Roosevelt and the arena, being the man in the arena, living a certain way. It's gonna be a Western inspired brand with a made in America, which that's a whole nother
hard to do.
Dude, we would have launched 2 or 3 months ago if we. It's also just a learning experience. We have I've never built a clothing brand before, so like, you got to do it and then learn.
But you're in the arena.
Exactly.
That's literally the point of this whole thing.
Exactly. So yeah, it'll be a Western inspired brand. It will be in the belief that truth is exclusive and beauty is exclusive. It will not, like, we're not going to market it as like the thing that's for everybody. It's not going to be for everybody. It will be priced accordingly. It will be marketed, and the story that we will tell will be reflective of that. But it's sort of an ode to men like Teddy Roosevelt, who lived strenuous life. They rejected the life of ignoble ease, as he would put it. He was in the arena. He lived in the truest sense, like he lived life. Like he was not a passive participant in this thing. He was like, he was in it. And so it'll be a long journey of creating clothes. Like you talked about your head appearance. It's a little thing, but it's also how you present yourself. Like, it's very much so how we present ourselves to the world, I believe, to be very much so reflective of how we understand ourselves internally. And so it'll be a long journey of creating things that people can wear that tell a certain story.
I love that. Well, I'll be excited to represent that and see what you guys make. Also talk just shop behind the scenes, because I'll also be entering the arena as well this year. Super cool. I think, like, I just love to see people entering the arena, like whatever their projects are. And I believe deeply in the rising tide lifts all ships. So giving you the ability to like platform that here as an announcement, and where can people stay tuned on that stuff? Yeah,
so right now my Instagram and Twitter, which is Tyro Nolan, Tyro Nolan on Twitter or X, whatever, and then Nolan Wilson Real on Instagram. The website will be roughriderusa.com, I believe. Yeah, those are 2 places.
Nice.
2 places.
All your links will be in the description, but we're getting a little ahead of ourselves because we do still have the closer questions of the pod. First, if you could go back to a younger version of yourself and tell him one thing, what would that be?
Go for freedom. Can I elaborate on that?
Yes.
One of my favorite, and this is actually not the answer to the question, the other question about the quote, but one of my favorite quotes as of late is by a guy named Sam Zell. Yep. If you've heard of him, he said, "Go for freedom." This is not a direct quote, but it's the general gist. Go for freedom. If you go for freedom, you'll do what you like. If you do what you like, you'll do it for a long time. If you do something for a long time, you'll get really good at it. If you do something for a long time and get really good at it, you'll make a lot of money. So I would tell my younger self, I would actually encourage myself, because I think I've done that at large in my life. I would encourage myself to continue going for freedom.
I love that. Couldn't agree more. Secondly, what is one quote that has always stuck with you or that you try to live by?
Preach the gospel always, and if necessary, use words. By St. Francis of Assisi. And
I've been to that chapel.
Have you really? Where is that?
Assisi.
Is that in Italy? I don't know.
Yeah.
That's epic.
Yeah.
That would be cool to go to.
Beautiful.
well, that's a whole other can of worms we could talk about that on another podcast.
Next time, part 2.
Yeah. I want to elaborate on that too, because your comment about if you can't conjure up the quote in the moment, it's not the quote.
Yep.
The first quote that came to my mind when you said that was that quote, and I'm like, well, is that it? And then I thought about it. You know the quote, to be rather than seem? I think that's very much, it's kind of like synonymous with that quote. It's the idea of like living your actions and your life being reflective, like the true reflection of how you live, rather than like what you espouse or what you like, the facade that you build up. So yeah, preach the gospel always, and if necessary, use words.
Amazing. Finally, what do you believe is your unique gift to give the world?
I have an intense curiosity about a lot of things, about the best way to kill a 6x6 elk with a bow in Montana, about how to build a successful business, about how to father children and be a good husband, about podcasting, about how to make a good podcast, about how to speak well, about how to write, about so many different things. It's just how I've always been, and for a while I kind of thought of it as a negative. I had a limiting belief in that way, where I was like, I need to pick something. And as of late specifically, I've really been leaning into the intuition and that God will, like this book thing is a good example. God, I literally just feel like God was like, hey, you love reading. It's the most stimulating form of knowledge gaining or study for you. Like, you love it. You have a podcast. Why don't you and you love learning about these people. Why don't you start doing that? And just things like that. So I would say satisfying or exploring those curiosities and giving people insight into that journey that will then inform them in their journey of exploration as well.
Amazing. Well, I appreciate you, brother. I appreciate anyone that's made it thus far. Thank you for spending your attention, your most valuable resource, with myself and Nolan today. Memento Mori, and be the Renaissance.
Can I say something before we get off?
Of course. Also, yeah, subscribe to YouTube, all that stuff. Yeah. Forgot my CTAs.
I want to give you, I think you said this once, like giving people their flowers. I texted you once, I said, your belief inspires me. And I really mean that. I want to give you your flowers on your platform, because seeing your level of belief has challenged me, because even the amount that you've believed in yourself I've noticed, I'm like, dude, why does Zach believe in himself? So like, why is he so bullish on his like stuff? Like, where does it come from? But like there's this like, it's not animosity, but there's like this like question, like, where does that come from? Like, is he like, how is he so bullish on this path? But every time I come back to the fact, I'm like, it is inspiring, because it gives people green lights, myself included. It's given me green lights to believe in myself and the path that God has laid out for me more fervently and more faithfully. So I want to thank you for your belief.
Well, yeah, I almost an impossible compliment to respond to. So I'll start with thank you. And then to just briefly answer, where does it come from? It comes from God. Like, it's one of those things, like you've kind of alluded to, you simply can't even take credit for it. Like, when you have these ideas, when you have this inspiration, and I don't even care how hacky this may like sound, but like, yeah, I can't source it anywhere else than divine. And interesting, you use the word inspire. Inspire comes from the Latin in spiritus, which means to breathe in spirit, fill someone with spirit and breath. So inspirational, aspirational, these types of things, you're filling someone with the spirit. And it is only in the overflowing of my cup that I can pour into other people. So I'm grateful for everything that I have, and yeah, just to be in the arena duking it out, bro. It's good stuff.
Right on. Amen. I appreciate it, man.
Thank you, guys. I'll see you on the next one.
And if he fails, at least fails while daring greater, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat.